Hello, this is William Allen with my EDL 855 Module 9 case study, a study looking at a moral dilemma that is created when school policy clashes with ethics. So first, to summarize the case and establish some facts, looking at the major players involved, we have Mr. Inman, who is in his first year at Rocket Junior High. He is the assistant principal. He is from the south side of town, which they imply is kind of the rougher neighborhood. And then we have James, who is 15, tattooed, muscular, also from the south side. Doesn't have a great reputation. Then we have David, who is 13 years old. He's slightly built. He's an honor student. He plays trombone in the band. And we also have the school police officer, both mothers of James and David, and the director of secondary education. So as I mentioned before, it took place at Rocket Junior High, which is notable because James is 15 years old, which is the age of a freshman or sophomore in high school typically. So I'm going to guess that maybe he was held back. I'm not sure. But he is probably older than most of the kids at this junior high school. There is 900 students total, so it's a big school. It's a normal spring day, and it took place, the incident that occurs is going to take place during 5th period, and it will take place in the hallway in the office of Mr. Inman, and as well as the youth detention facility. Ugh. So what exactly occurred? So Mr. Inman had worked hard to form a relationship with James and his friend. He stayed after school, played basketball with them, got to know him a little better, and as a result of that, James's behavior was improving. He was getting better grades, but that week was not as good, or it seemed to be not as good, because he was called to the office to discuss his third tardy for the week. So once he was called to the office, a teacher called him back to the classroom, James, after she thought she saw drugs exchanged between James and David. And I'm going to guess that she called Mr. Inman because after he received this news, he called and had the school the school police officer escort David to his office, shortly followed by James. He also allowed the police officer to stay in the room while he questioned them. James admitted to having David hold something for him. When David was questioned, he got visibly upset. He was shaking, tears filled his eyes, and then the school police officer searched David and found brass knuckles. And he was put in handcuffs where he immediately started crying and was very upset. And James fessed up and admitted that David was only in possession of the knuckles because James had threatened to beat him up if he would not hold him. So James wasn't wanting to get caught when he was brought to the principal's office with them, so he gave them to David, or we could infer that's what happened. Both were subsequently arrested because it was illegal to have a weapon on the premises. It's considered a felony charge, and with the zero tolerance policy of the school, they both would be referred to a special disciplinary program for 45 days minimum. And these events lead us to the dilemma that Mr. Inman now faces, which I'll discuss later on. After the incident occurred, James's mother was called, and she was not surprised. She said, let him sit there in juvenile detention for a while so he can think about what he's done. Whereas David's mother was very upset, came in right away, was upset. Mr. Inman explained the situation. All he did was hand her the address of the facility where David was being held, and she burst into tears and left. So it did not go over very well. Mr. Inman had lots of regrets after this incident. So now to report any legal or ethical issues. Was there harm done? Yes, there was lots of harm done in this scenario. James was placed in the DAEP, which is the disciplinary program, which I'll discuss in a little bit, and he was placed in juvenile detention pretty fittingly because he was in possession of the knuckles. David was arrested, however, which was emotionally damaging. I'm sure he was very shaken up by the incident, and his record could permanently be damaged depending on what occurs next. David's mother was also harmed. She was very upset in this scenario, and then Mr. Inman is also in harm's way potentially based off his decision. So was a law broken? Absolutely yes. James was in possession of a weapon at school, which is a felony charge, and David also technically was in possession as well, but as I said earlier, for circumstances that could be argued beyond his control, right? He was threatened, and that's why he was holding them for James. So was a contract breached? Mr. Inman, again, potentially, depending on what he decides to do with what he's been told by his supervisor, which would be to go ahead and fill out the paperwork. So he should suspend David according to the school's policy, but he cannot bring himself to do it ethically. He just feels awful about the scenario. He doesn't want any more harm to come to David, and he feels the policy has put him in a position that it shouldn't have put him in. He also feels that he wrongfully handled the situation and he contributed to the harm that was already done to David and is wishing to avoid that. So he has been told by his director of secondary education that he needs to go ahead and write up the paperwork that is required to suspend David. So depending on what he decides to do, that is the dilemma. So to summarize it, a hasty response and a lack of forethought from Mr. Inman brought about an unjust arrest of an innocent student and other negative consequences. Man, I'm having trouble speaking. So again, the people involved, just real quick, again, were the assistant principal, James, David, the police officer, both mothers, and the director of secondary education. It took place at Rocket Junior High. We don't know what city, we don't really know the demographics of the area, other than that it was implied that the south side of the city or town is not a great place to be. The program involved is the school itself, and as well as the disciplinary alternative education program, which Mr. James now finds himself in for the who knows how many times he's been there before, it said, and David could potentially also find himself in this program as well. So again, what damage could be done? The students are going to suffer the consequences of the arrests and suspension or suspensions, depending on whether David is suspended. There's emotional trauma involved, potentially, for David and his mother. Mr. Inman's reputation is at stake, depending on what choice he makes, and David's reputation is very much at stake, depending on Mr. Inman's choice. Again, the variety of stakeholders are going to be involved, especially the students and the parents. Can a decision be made based off the information that we have? I believe yes, we can move forward. What I don't know about this case is there potential to add language to the school policy that is the zero tolerance policy, and what actions will best make reparation for the harm done is the question that Mr. Inman is asking himself at the moment. So option 1, don't suspend David, take no action. In this case, we would not suspend David, so don't take the action of writing up the paperwork, and ignore requests from the director. Option 2 would be to suspend David and follow the protocol and policy of the school. Option 3, don't suspend David, follow up with David and his parents, and address the policy for the future. Option 4 would be to suspend David and address the policy for the future. So looking at some pros and cons of each of those. In option 1, David is not harmed further. Mr. Inman is following his personal code of ethics. Mr. Inman is formally reprimanded, which is going to go in his file, and the policy still persists. So we have good and bad, but the policy still persists and could be a potential hazard down the road for a similar situation. Option 2, Mr. Inman is not going to be reprimanded. David is harmed further by being suspended, and his reputation is going to be hurt, and personally, Mr. Inman's ethics are going to be violated by that decision to suspend David. Option 3, David is again not harmed further if we don't suspend him. The policy itself is addressed, and Mr. Inman is reprimanded and takes the blame for himself. Option 4, David is harmed further if we do suspend him, but the policy is going to be addressed, hopefully to prevent scenarios like this down the road, and Mr. Inman is not reprimanded. So choosing the best option in this scenario, since we can't go back in time and change the way that Mr. Inman handled this situation, I would go with option 3. I would not suspend David. I don't want to put any more harm on him. I would accept the reprimand personally if I were Mr. Inman, and I would work to add language to the policy to protect students like David in similar scenarios. So where he was put, you could say he was coerced or he was put under duress to hold this weapon and he had no intention of using it himself. Why would I do that? I believe that is putting the students first rather than myself first or Mr. Inman first. Personal ethics is pushing Mr. Inman to act accordingly. He's already feeling like this is the correct course of action. And zero tolerance policies have good intentions, but this scenario demonstrates that they can also have negative consequences. So if we're strictly following the policy, David is going to suffer a lot more than what most people would view as that he should. So implementing this decision to, again, try to address the policy, not suspend David and take the blame myself or as Mr. Inman. The first step is to accept the formal reprimand by not suspending David, to have it permanently go into the file and be a model of good ethics. The second step would be to schedule a meeting with David and his parents to address the incident. So pretending it never happened isn't going to help anyone. So addressing that incident is going to say a lot about Mr. Inman. The next step would be to work with administration and leaders to advocate for change in the policy, whether that is an added clause about, again, coercion or duress, some kind of language that will protect students like David from being put in this awful scenario. And then number 4, in the future, be more careful when calculating a response to similar scenarios. So as Mr. Inman was in the process of the whole incident, he felt that he shouldn't have had the police officer in the room at the same time. He probably could have taken, other steps before he got so involved or before he brought on such action, such strong action. If it were a weapon that the teacher had thought was passed to him, then maybe he acted accordingly, but he probably could have investigated a little before himself and talked to them individually because it was drugs and there was no one that was an immediate harm. So he probably could have investigated before he took the action that he did. So just in the future to consider the outcomes and the consequences of his actions. And that is my presentation. Thank you for watching.